Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Got Mental Health Podcast. I am your co-host, Rachel Cove. I am a multi-passionate entrepreneur, author, artist, mother, and certified recovery coach.
I'm your co-host, Arthur Mogilevsky, entrepreneur, girl dad, animal activist, and owner of AM Healthcare, a premier substance abuse and mental health treatment program.
With the collective experience of 21 years working in the mental health field, we are excited to bring to you a safe and fun place to talk all things mental health.
We will be interviewing experts, thought leaders, entrepreneurs, and professionals in the entertainment industry to better educate, inform, and inspire our community to have positive mental wealth.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Got Mental Health Podcast. I am your co-host, Rachel Cove, along with my other co-host, Arthur Mogilevsky.
Mogilevsky, Rachel.
Is it Mogilevsky?
It's Mogilevsky.
Mogilevsky.
Enunciate.
Okay.
All right.
We have Brandon Burns on the show today. Brandon Burns is the Chief Executive Officer and founding partner of Peaks Recovery Centers. Prior to becoming Peaks CEO in June of 2020, Brandon was Peaks Director of Operations and Director of Business Development. He's played a key role in the success of Peaks and the company's continued growth and expansion efforts. Brandon sees the behavioral healthcare industry as fraught with fragmentation and lacking a unified approach to treating substance abuse disorder. SUD. And mental health. From his CEO role, Brandon has moved to challenge industry-wide narratives that continue to frustrate patient care and outcomes, including his passion and support for the Natural Medicine Health Act and the innovative potential for plant-based medicines within behavioral healthcare settings. His approach to building company-wide culture and implementing company-wide core values is the foundation of Peaks' operational momentum and customer satisfaction. Welcome to the show, Brandon.
Welcome, Brandon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So I think we were just talking about it, but I really wanted to bring you onto the show to talk about plant medicine. So let's just go there immediately. What is your personal, professional relationship to plant medicine, and how do you see it benefiting the mental health system in the future?
Yeah, so there's where to start on this
know.
one. Where I'm currently sitting, I would say that let's start here, right? Okay, so I think it's important to kind of like digest and see kind of what the greater landscape of mental health is and how we've arrived at such a devastating sort of mental health epidemic here in America. So, for example, as your listeners and viewers out there may have seen or heard, 1 in 4 Americans, or over 70 million Americans, will go on to meet criteria for major depression at some point in their lives in America. How is this possible to have more Western-based interventions in circulation than any time in our history? That includes SSRIs, SNRIs, any medication protocols, certainly talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, all of these modalities, right? Yet rates of depression, for example, continue to rise in America at an alarming rate. And so I think, right, that's scary, right? How do we have all the interventions and all this beautiful Western medicine, and at the same time, the epidemic continues forward? And one of the things that I like to just kind of suggest kind of as the framework for kind of bringing this forward is sort of a causal root, a more sincere approach or thought, maybe to get your viewers or listeners to be thinking about. And I would like to suggest a root cause for consideration, starting with the Journal of Affective Disorders in 2012. And they concluded that the economic and marketing forces of modern society have engineered an environment that maximizes consumption at the long-term cost of well-being. And in effect, humans have dragged a body with a long hominid history into an overfed, malnourished, sedentary, sunlight deficient, sleep-deprived, competitive, inequitable, and socially isolating environment with dire consequences. And the reason for kind of bringing that forward to, you guys and your listeners is to really highlight that I think the cause of our mental health suffering is massive. And we are still unable with our current sort of paradigm to nurture that direction. And so to bring it back to plant-based medicines, this industry has lacked, specifically substance use disorders and mental health, has lacked innovation for a really long time. So the first thing for me is that plant-based medicine, especially here in the state of Colorado, psilocybin, and any other psychedelics, MDMA, hopefully will be coming over the fence as well too here, represent an opportunity of innovation. But because the cause is so large, maybe modernity, maybe our biology is not suited for modernity in this regard. We should caution or not overstate that, plant-based medicines as a monotherapeutic value are going to be the, silver bullet to resolve this. At the same time, there is power in it and there is innovative opportunity. And as an industry that has, for example, right, we have an overdose epidemic taking place in America, a lot of Americans dying from fentanyl overdoses and so forth. Yet we still have treatment centers stating, I'm not going to provide medication assisted treatment. I mean, so we have a great deal of potential to resolve a lot of issues at the end of the day. And so when I say our industry is fraught with fragmentation, we have personal philosophies in the way of patient care at the end of the day. And from my position, we're not going to have any philosophies in front of us. We're going to figure out a way. If these medicines can save lives at the end of the day, we should take that seriously. And if it saves one more life than it would have otherwise, I think that has an incredible value proposition. And so for me, I'm passionate about the cause. I want to, kind of subdue maybe our excitement because past monotherapeutic values, even cognitive behavioral therapy, the SSRIs, all of that stuff, over time have showcased in and of themselves have little value. And so I think there's a cautionary tale here, and ultimately at the same time, a beautiful story of innovation right at our fingertips. And I think we should embrace this in a really big way.
So here's where I stand with this, right? Because it's the beauty and the beast situation, right? You have an amazing opportunity to be innovative, creative, and bring in something from a different perspective. It's not a cure. It's not going to solve the problem. It will help particular individuals reach positive outcomes and get to a safe place and a place where they can start working on a lot of the things that they are struggling with, right? You have conversations with people that are in the business side, scientific side of things, legal side. Then you have conversations with healers, people that have been working with psilocybin, MDA, MDMA, any type of plant-based medicine for hundreds of years, right? They don't want it to be legalized. They don't want it to be in used as a business or in a treatment setting because of our society's inability to keep things simple and always be hungry for more, right? The moment that these things become legal, and you've seen this with marijuana, right? You legalize marijuana, it has taken away from the purity of what it was years ago. And we probably share a similar friend or in Ben Court, who speaks about marijuana and marijuana use and distribution passionately, and they've abused it. They've taken it, they've extracted it, they tried to manipulate it, they created a world of monetary gain. And so how do you balance the world of the healer who's been doing it quietly, without publicity, and healing people, and now bring it into the world of treatment in the business side of things, legally, and not manipulate it in a way where it creates more harm than good?
Yeah. I mean, big question, $1 million answer coming your guys'
Yes.
way right now.
Let's do it.
I think a couple things. If I could just lay the foundation of the Natural Medicine Health Act,
Please.
I think that would be supportive of the discussion as we move through it. So the Natural Medicine Health Act here in the state of Colorado, also known as Proposition 122, that was on the ballot this last November, was passed by the voters by about a 53% to 47%, 53 for, 47% against. It's also known as Senate Bill SB23-290 here in Colorado, which was approved by the Senate, signed by the governor, and goes into law July 1st here in the state of Colorado, I believe is the final signatory date on that. But the Natural Medicine Health Act would allow regulated access for adults 21 and older to natural psychedelic medicines, including psilocybin mushrooms that show a promise in treating mental health conditions. It also creates a regulated therapy system, so adults could access natural psychedelic therapy under the supervision of a licensed facilitator at designated and licensed healing centers. It would also remove all criminal penalties for personal use and possession of natural psychedelic medicines. However, it would not allow for recreational sale in that regard in the state. And so we're balancing two things here, and we'll get a little bit closer to your point of the indigenous cultures and references and so forth. But there is a regulated market taking place, and there is an unregulated market taking place. And I think there's, at least from what I know in the state of Colorado and the people I've been in front of, there's a lot of tension with the unregulated aspect of things, right? This can get out of control in a variety of ways. And I think there's deep concerns within the general public that we should talk about and be honest about at the end of the day. One level below this, the act itself creates an advisory board. That advisory board is made up of 15 individuals, and within that advisory board has to have indigenous representation, because the overarching goal of the creators of this was we need to have reverence for these medicines, and we need not commercialize them, and we need not put, 3.5 grams of psilocybin into a single, gummy bear to a Ben Court point, right, who of course wrote Weed Incorporated, right? And I think as well too, to Ben Court's point as well too, I think Ben's got a lot going for him in the conversation, right? We should not have all this milligrams of THC into a single gummy bear and we don't know what's actually in it. At the same time, I would appreciate it if he would just come out and say, the plants are fine, grow them in your backyard. We can have reverence for that, but all this other stuff is nonsense. And so that's between me and Ben. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you got advisory board, you got 15 members on it. It has to have indigenous representation to support the historical catalog that and support of those individuals who've done this for thousands of years. And then it has 8 subcommittees below it: ethics, regulatory, all of these things providing feedback to the advisory board. And we talked about it a little bit on the beginning of the show. That means for a place like, a Peaks Recovery Centers or, a treatment center whatsoever in the state of Colorado, we're not actually going to be able to put this into play until Q1 of 2025, until all of these things are considered. So long story short here, you have this impressive measure that has busted through what I think historically we never thought would have happened. But at the same time, it's just the foundation. And the advisory board represents the building blocks to nurture reverence for medicines. How are we going to handle this? How are we going to set up crisis case management and response systems in the way that medical marijuana, maybe as a legislative, kind of approach, failed in many aspects? How are we going to organize this so that the public education is in something like, to your point and Ben Court's point, where we're not going to be, smoking pot daily to quell our anxiety, when in reality, the purpose of these medicines is to be taken once, twice a year, never mind all the sort of microdosing noise, that kind of goes on in the background. But from a macro dose standpoint, that's really the way this is being approached. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if I could just create a quick metaphor for it as well, I see our goal as a treatment program to bring individuals to the trailhead. We're in the state of Colorado, so we keep everything in hiking and, that sort of thing. Well, we prepare them for the trailhead, we prepare them for the journey ahead to get to the summit, but we can't walk that path with them. And my great hope for psychedelics, at least psychedelic medicines and the way that we're talking about them, is that generally when they get to that trailhead, they kind of want to promise that what we've showcased to them is going to get them to the other side. But without us, that journey is filled with, trees and rocks and cliffs and all of this sort of stuff at the end of the day. And I think that the potential for psychedelic medicine isn't to heal them from what they're doing. It's to give confidence, to remove all that stuff between the trailhead and the summit, at least psychologically speaking, that gives room for that journey in front of them in a way that's very difficult to see, as we may know on this, show and talking with others, in that early recovery process that's very blurred. So,
how do you see the difference between psychedelics and SSRIs?
Well, a couple of things. So I want to be very clear before we, dive into the SSRIs. Absolutely, these medicines, from a Western-based approach, have definitely saved lives, and they have definitely improved the outcomes of individuals across the United States. The tragedy of SSRIs, post monotherapeutic value, the University of College London just came out with their study in July of 2022 as a multidisciplinary review study. I believe it reviewed over 20,000 separate SSRI studies, and their conclusion was this has nothing to do with a biochemical imbalance in the brain. Namely, it has nothing to do with serotonin levels. So to kind of tie that back to how it saves lives, it is working We just don't know why anymore at the end of the day. And then when you look at the individual studies, you're seeing anywhere, I'm seeing, I should say, 15 to 30% outcomes, right? And 85% of the public is treated with major depression with SSRIs as a monotherapeutic value. And you can find all this in the University College London studies as well too. But 85% are treated in that way with a single approach, the SSRI medication, that only works 15 to 30% of the time. I mean, do the maths, right? It's not as effective as we once believed, yet billions of dollars are poured into this every year, and we're being told a story that it's a chemical imbalance, and it's not. And so for me, the difference between the two is one, we don't know really why this is working, the SSRIs, but it does work and it does save lives, and we shouldn't take that away. But the research is coming through in a really big way. And I'm not a researcher at the end of the day, so you have to excuse not being able to point to immediate studies. I can showcase some opportunities for your viewers if you guys would like, where they can go and access doctors talking about this and so forth. But ultimately, at the end of the day, psilocybin and its effects, it has physiological effects that it can cure cluster headaches and some of these more dynamic type physical ailments. But at the end of the day, I think it's not going to cure something like a depression. It's going to give rise to the opportunity for a depressed patient to go, you know what? I can get out of bed today. You know what? That chatter in my head, it's kind of silly. And I want to talk to my therapist more about that. To me, it's an opening up of a doorway that otherwise can't be perceived while we're suffering within the current moment.
I think the benefit of having you on this show, because we're Rachel and I both are very curious in this world, and we definitely would love to have as much information as possible for the viewership, because it is going to be coming, and it's going to be coming in a very big way. I think the benefit of having you on our show is really to be able to dive into the structure, the regulatory aspect, and how it's going to come to life, because if you've never participated in a healing process, or taking any of these types of medicines, whether it be in a healing state or for fun or whatever it is, it can be a scary thing for somebody, right? Like, what? I'm going to eat mushrooms and go on a trip. Like, so it could be an entirely different process than for someone like yourself or us, who have a little bit more education and understanding of the medicine itself, right? So I want to go back to the framework and the structure that Colorado has developed in creating this regulatory foundation that you're speaking of. How much of it does it differentiate from the regulatory creation for the marijuana industry? Because Colorado was at the forefront for marijuana legalization, right? It's at the forefront for most of these things, right?
Mhm.
Kind of, I say this in an envious way, because California follows like 5 years or 6 years later or so.
Mhm.
You described it where part of the regulatory body is incorporating some of these healers as consultants and to help guide the framework, right? Did they do the
Mhm.
same thing for marijuana? Or was that taken a little bit looser? Because at one point you weren't able to use it recreationally. Now you can. My fear is that you're going to be able to use mushrooms recreationally in due time as well, because the state benefits from a tax standpoint, financially, right? So can you go into that? Like, how is the framework structured in the same way as it was for marijuana?
Yeah, yeah, great question. I think honing in a little bit more on kind of the marijuana legislation, that the where psilocybin sits in the research base of things, it's a lot closer to the legislation, right? There's still a gap, right? And that's what the advisory board and what the future is, right? We
Hmm.
have to figure out a way to negotiate these off ramps. Some of the consequences that are no doubt going to rise of this. I mean, I'm going to be fully transparent. Even somebody who backs it, there will be consequences to this. There will be misuse and abuse. There will
Hmm.
be, 911 phone calls and all those types of things, right? And this is where I think public education should come in. I was recently on one of the panels discussions as a moderator for actually this last weekend for the inaugural psychedelic symposium in Aspen, Colorado. And one of those things that I talked about just openly, it was like we have to nurture the consequences here in a way that was missed from a marijuana legislative standpoint. And let's be real, when we talk about healing, in quotation marks, or medical marijuana, right? In quotation, those are great political points. but they don't actually like match reality in a really big sense of things, right? The
Mm.
Natural Medicine Health Act is way bigger than just healing components of it, right? It's also got anti-prohibition, statements and movements with, working with inside of it, for example. Same thing on the medical marijuana side of things. But to kind of narrow it down more and focus there, I think the research closer to legislation in a way that marijuana is like this. I also think that when we came up with the notion of medical marijuana, it flies entirely in the face of the evidence of how dopamine structures work. And, sort of my quick view of that just comes out of the book Dopamine Nation, right? But you got the pleasure lever and you got the pain lever, right? At the end of the day, it may be adaptive for a person or an individual, right, who's having a tough day to go have a drink. Maybe smoke a little bud to take the anxiety or the edge off, right? At the end of the day, maybe there's an appropriate way to frame that, right? You're feeling pain, smoke some pot, have a drink, push down on that lever, rebalance that dopamine effect. But at the end of the day, dopamine as a chemical system, right, wants to be in homeostasis, right? It's not going to be on the side of pleasure or pain. And this is what I'm getting to with marijuana. You keep pushing down on that pleasure center every single day. When dopamine wants to be in homeostasis, the cause is more pain. So for individuals who are like, why smoke pot daily for anxiety? I guarantee they're experiencing more anxiety at the end of the day. I mean, that's what
Right.
Dopamine Nation is promising at the end of the day. So it's not it's not appropriate to take it daily in that regard. It can be adaptive, but daily becomes maladaptive. And so I think what I'm learning from psychedelics, especially psilocybin in this regard, is it's not a dopaminergic sort of pleasure pushing. It has more to do, I forget the chemical name of it, but with the serotonin levels in this regard. And if you use psychedelics every single day, it will stop working in the way that marijuana gives you a little bit, at least maybe in the morning, wake or bake, to use poor language and all that type of stuff. So it's not as consequential. It can't be used in the same way. Our brains literally will stop hallucinating, whatever we're thinking about it at the end of the day. And so I think it has real barriers to it in a way that pot doesn't necessarily allow for.
Mm.
But more to like that legislative value. Anybody I've been talking to in this industry, and I mean like, Celtic people of all walks of life and backgrounds, I think more than the marijuana movement, there is deep consideration and thought to this. Like, there are going to be consequences. Let's be open about those consequences. But it has a great potential to it. Let's be real about what that potential is. And also at the same time, this measure in particular, differently from marijuana, to Ben Court's point, you can go, put on your door sign, hey, we got gummy bears here, and conflate the value of gummy bears with a ton of THC in it. You can't advertise for psychedelic services in the state of Colorado under this measure. You cannot advertise openly and state something like, we sell psilocybin mushrooms, because you can't sell it here in the state of Colorado. The advisory board will figure out how those are passed through from a regulatory standpoint. But at the end of the day, Peaks Recovery Centers, for example, isn't going to be able to put on its website, hey, we do psychedelic treatment with mushrooms, come to Peaks today. It's got to be something more benign, like we can, in a variety of ways, service mental health, individuals struggling with mental health, PTSD, so forth, call us today.
Mm.
So that's a real important thing to highlight differently from the marijuana legislation. Obviously, it doesn't keep businesses from stating it ultimately. Eventually, you got to state, yeah, we can provide that service to you, but you can't advertise it directly in the way that marijuana can. And I think that's a big thing. And you can't sell it recreationally. So in the unregulated market side of things, this probably isn't going to quell all fears about it. You can't sell it, but you can grow it. Obviously, they're quite easy to grow as a resource in that regard. But once you grow it, you cannot sell it unless it is under that regulated aspect. So if you're caught selling it, there are criminal penalties for that, right? There are so many of these barriers that take place. And so ultimately, if you want to grow it, your friends come over, you gift it to your friends in your backyard and you guys have a good time, whatever, like the state's fine with that. But if you grow it and then turn and sell it to a minor, turn to sell it to another adult, in this regard, there are criminal consequences for that.
Okay, so I have a few questions. So
Hmm.
this is not something that you're offering as a modality or treatment yet in
For
your
sure.
treatment center. So is the plan to be able so actually I don't know a lot about your treatment center. You treat substance abuse and things related to that, and trauma and PTSD and mental health related issues.
Hmm. Hmm.
So some people would say that they shouldn't do any type of psychedelic treatment until someone has at least a year of abstinence from any substances that they were addicted to. What do you say to that opinion?
So I think to be real about the consequences, because I don't want to be caught 2 years from now saying, Brandon, you said there'd be no consequence. There will be consequence. There will be misuse and abuse, right? At the end of the day. What I'm more hopeful for is in my general, so an anecdotal evidence here would say something like in the last, we've treated over 1,700 individuals here at Peaks Recovery. We're still a small center, 36 beds at this time over the course of 9 years. So it's not an incredible database, but at the same time, we've had no more than 14 primary diagnoses of psychedelic misuse and abuse disorders, right? In that regard, or hallucinogenic disorders, I think they're called in that regard. So a very small subset of peaks, in our view, suffers from that. And we often find within our patient demographic, when they were using, let's say they have an opioid use disorder. When they were using psychedelics, it was like one time in the forest somewhere on a lake, just enjoying things with their friends. And the use categories start to look a lot different. And when we go to that dopamine center of things, if it is true that mushrooms don't push down on that pleasure lever in the way that opioids do, alcohol does, marijuana does, methamphetamines for sure, benzodiazepines, right, and all those categories, then we're getting a little bit away from its potential for that abuse, because if it's all centered around the dopamine pleasure lever and it doesn't really offer that, I think we're in a different space of misuse and abuse. And so it is true that we've seen it in treatment programs, right? People come in maybe with an opioid use disorder and they say, look, heroin's my problem, but not alcohol. The problem is when they go to use alcohol is that if they're still experiencing pain, whether that's PTSD, whether it's depression, anxiety, unresolved relationship issues, like whatever the case might be, the brain is looking for that opioid as the solution. If you just replace the opioid with alcohol when there's pain, the brain's going to reject that. And I think that's where it gets conflated in the industry when we think about how this is working. If you want to have alcohol as an opioid user to just like have a drink at the end of a day or every other day, that's probably fine. But if you're using that as a replacement therapy in place of the opioid, that's where addiction continues to get conflated. And that's where our brains take us right back to, the opioid use. So my hope here is that we're not using within a treatment setting like Peaks, and hear me too, right? Set and setting. This is what the indigenous cultures and indigenous potential is here about. You really need like a 4 to 6 week runway just to set up the therapy to go into the intervention itself in that regard. So you're going to take a good amount of time to negotiate how this set and setting, what we're going to work through, what we're going to dive into during that, intense therapeutic session on the macro dose. So it's going to be thoughtfully played out. At least that's my experience. It should go that way, right? To get the individual, centered for it. And then we're talking one dose and maybe a follow-up dose 6 months from then, and not to be used daily or promoted as a microdose, within that regard. So I also just wanted to quickly touch base on the SSRI thing, because I think that's important. If you are on SSRIs and you're choosing to do this therapy, or whether you're just curious about how that works, the common knowledge here is, and the research and the education and so forth, is you have to taper off those SSRIs to actually receive the benefits of the psilocybin, the psychedelic mushrooms in that regard. So that's another sort of catch thing there. If 85% of the population with major depression, 85% of 70 million people have to taper off this to use these medicines, like the regulatory aspects like greatly matter, and you have to go to your provider, you have to see a doctor, you have to go through all those protocols to taper accordingly. And I just want to make that known out there, because those medicines are contraindicated together.
So if someone comes into your treatment center, they come in with complex PTSD, trauma, addiction issues. What makes someone better for a psilocybin session versus an EMDR session versus a regular CBT session? Why would someone be like what makes one better than the other?
What's probably
Yeah.
better, like good question would be, what's the assessment process
Right.
look like? Like, how do you assess which patient would be better for which trial?
It's a better question.
I mean, it's
Yeah,
not a better question.
yeah.
I'm
So
sorry. I'm
It's okay. No, I mean, it is a better question.
teamwork,
it's
teamwork
like we
over
do a
there. Yeah,
podcast together.
Something like that, whatever this
yeah.
is.
I I don't. I think so. The way we look at treatment, right? If you're just going to deliver cognitive behavioral therapy as an evidence-based practice for major depression, for example, I believe the studies follow something like this. You're doing one cognitive behavioral therapy session per week over the course of 8 to 12 weeks. And 50% of the time in the monotherapeutic studies, it has an outcome of reduced depression symptomology or no depression whatsoever, right? And so, but that's a really long time to suffer. If the SSRI works and, tertiary SSRI, so if the first one didn't work, the second one's less likely to work, the third, the different classes, your SNRIs, same thing. If the first one didn't work, the second one's less likely to work and so forth. But if they do work, 4 to 6 weeks for it to have that neuro uptick in our brains to go, okay, yeah, I'm feeling something now, right? So cognitive behavioral therapy for major depression offers a 3 month window. The SSRIs at their best, a 30 to 45 day window before you start feeling some relief at the end of the day. So for me, my thought about treatment and the insertion of psychedelics isn't to say you get CBD over here, you get SSRIs, and you get psychedelics over here. It's more of a spiderweb approach. And I think it's a better way to look at it, that when somebody comes into an inpatient setting, they need to be detoxed. If they're going to be on psychedelics and they're on SSRIs, they need to be tapered off that, right? There are some things that have to be negotiated. But let's say somebody comes in and, a place like Peaks, right? We have TMS machines. So we can do the TMS for the major depression. We can hit them with the SSRIs if that's going to provide relief. Or we believe that's going to provide greater relief in the short term than in the long term, which would mean you're going to push psychedelics way out into the future as a way to look at it. I think you have to look at contraindications, such as the family history of psychosis, manic episodes. Schizophrenia is certainly contraindicated in all of this. There's got to be a way to state authentically these types of people, unfortunately, given their mental health circumstance, will never be invited to the psychedelic party. And I think that's right size. It's unfortunate, but it's a consequence of just the features of the diagnosis. So to me, at the end of the day, I think it has to be a discussion between the patient, the client, if we will, and the doctor and the clinical team and so forth. Not everybody gets these medicines, right? I think when we look at ketamine as a psychiatric intervention that's taking place right now, there is a way in which, like, some clinics, everybody gets ketamine. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense, right? At the end of the day, I know it can provide relief in those types of things, but more thoughtfully, when we see ketamine as an intervention at Peaks, where we see it greatly working is for people who don't necessarily have like a plan in place for their suicidal ideations, but just like a level below that, where like it's creeping up, like they're craving the suicidal opportunity. And when we hit them with ketamine, it greatly drowns that out, separates the brain in a dissociative way. I think psychedelics are more associative than disassociative. And we see the SI come down, and it's working really well in those regards. So, but how many patients want ketamine? A lot of them, when they hear about that experience. But here at Peaks, we're just stating, no, unless you have significant SI, it really has no value in our therapeutic structure. And so I think responsibility's got to come into play here. I love that we can't advertise for it directly. So not anybody and everybody can reach out and just say, that's what I'm going for. And I think it also comes back to education. All providers, individuals whatsoever, have a responsibility to negotiate with the patient or the client in front of them and say, look, this is not likely to be appropriate for you. We can consider it, but during that consideration time frame, we're going to be doing all these other things in support of you to see if this can really benefit you at the end of the day. If somebody's coming in with major depression and within like 7 days you hit them with a psychedelic, like that feels inappropriate to me. This has to be thoughtful. We have to create the routines for it. And now you're talking about a place like Peaks, you got 50 patients on one site, right? One person's doing a psychedelic over here and one can't do it over here. Like, there's tension there. And so if we're not going to live in the world of consequences and think thoughtfully about this, we're setting ourselves up for failure. And, I think what I said, at the Aspen Psychedelic Symposium too here, if we are not thoughtful about this, all this momentum, all this excitement around it, we will lose it entirely in the public face of things. And this is also where I think the movement is more responsible than the marijuana movement.
Do you think more gets done? Like, I hear people say when they've done a psilocybin session that one psilocybin session is like 20 hours of regular therapy. So why wouldn't everyone just go do some psychedelic sessions? We don't have that much time here on Earth. I don't
Right,
like we
right,
don't. We don't have that much time here.
right.
Why wouldn't someone go and have a psychedelic session that would help you in 5 hours versus 50 hours? Also, people don't have enough money to go see an EMDR therapist. I mean, to treat trauma is really expensive, and trauma is complex, and there's so many different layers. You unpack one piece of your trauma, and then it opens up 10,000 other layers of the trauma.
Hmm.
So I guess I see its benefit, and I also definitely see the consequences that could be really, really severe if it's not treated sacredly. I love that there's attention to the need to really treat it like a medicine. It's really
Hmm.
treating a wound. And
Hmm.
doctors don't look at a wound and say, oh, maybe it could use this, or maybe it could use that. They're like, this is what this is for, and this is what this is for. It's like there's distinct solutions. Regarding, so there's macrodosing and then there's microdosing. Unless I'm hearing this wrong, so you don't agree with microdosing every day? You don't agree with taking like microdosing every day, or
I, I, I mean, I'm open to it as a proposition, but from like an educational, like on a person by person basis, but from an educational standpoint, we are way over our ski tips. If we're just going to start stating something like everybody gets to take 200 milligrams per day, I've met, individuals who take 200 milligrams per day, but generally how it works, right? Because the brain only it has got a tripwire. It'll just stop working, whether it's a micro or macro dose. So what I'm hearing around individuals who are microdosing is they'll do something like 4 days on, 3 days off, 3 days on, 4 days off, rinse, wash, repeat, and that sort of thing, because the value proposition is limited. So if you want the effects of it, you can't use it every single day. So for me, I think it's misguided for anybody to state microdose every single day. I don't think there's any. I mean, I've been a part of this movement now, gratefully, and some pride behind it for about a year and a half now, and I have not heard anybody state seriously that you need to do this every single day at a microdose level, and absolutely at a macrodose level. Like should be, once a quarter, 2 to 4 times a year. Like it never gets beyond that in front of the researchers, the doctors I've been in front of, and so forth. So I'm open to it, but I think we live in a consumer culture, and that's kind of my big the Journal of Affective Disorders that I highlighted in the beginning. Right, we live in a consumer culture. The fact is, we don't need to be taking all this stuff every single day to find wellness, right? For trauma in particular, right? There is no medicine to that. To me, trauma is an event, and then the story we take away from that event, and it's going to take time to heal that story, at the end of the day. And we can't take something every day. Part of recovery, and I'm sure you guys have had recovery people on the podcast, and we share with our patients, the first thing you're going to do is kind of suffer. It kind of sucks not to have your coping mechanism with you each and every day. And the reality of psychedelic medicines is it's not going to cure you in this process. It's going to open windows and paths and make the journey possible for you, and maybe highlight some things that are really causing the drive for your maladaptive behaviors like, alcohol consumption and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's not a silver bullet. And if we're thinking about it in that way, I mean, this is going to go very poorly.
were you gonna say something?
Yeah, no, I mean, I have a lot of questions. I think you mentioned earlier about that. I think one of the benefits of the methadone programs that have existed, and I'm not condoning methadone treatment or anything like that, but I think one of the things that it has had that, let's say, Suboxone treatment has not, is the requirement to participate in clinical care with a licensed professional in conjunction with using methadone, right? You can't get the methadone unless you have an appointment to see the therapist or the clinician you're working with, right? What's the type of education or the requirements and the standards that are being set for the clinicians that are going to be working with your patients in conjunction with the plant-based medicine?
Yeah, so that's the so one of the on so these are all publicly available as well too. So, for your listeners out there, if anybody's interested in just kind of following the subcommittee conversations that are taking place through Colorado's Department of Regulatory Agencies, also known as DORA here in the great state of Colorado. Let's see, June 8th. So tomorrow, they're doing the Natural Medicine Advisory Board Qualifications Training and Licensing Subcommittee. So again, we have the advisory board up top that's designating all of the rules. So we have the foundation from the law, and then the advisory board is now creating all the steps to the use in the future. And then these advisory boards, these subcommittees, give insights to the advisory board to carry out the rules and regulations moving forward. So tomorrow, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, I think it's the second Natural Medicine Advisory Board Qualifications Training Licensing Subcommittee, but this is a subcommittee made up of 7 or 8 individuals, largely clinical and professional doctors, psychiatrists, and so forth. Also non-voting subcommittee members, but anyways, the public's available to it. These are the tools that are being utilized to negotiate the delivery of the services, how it's going to work, what you need to prepare for. At the end of the day, right, if you're a psychiatrist, maybe you only need 500 hours of training. If you're a licensed professional counselor in the state of Colorado, maybe that means 1,000 hours. If you're just the sort of level of a shaman, in all of this as a healing center, maybe you need 2,000 hours, of training and on-site, training and that type of thing. But again, these things are to be negotiated, but they are publicly available. They're accessible. And you can follow them through the Department of Regulatory Agencies.
Awesome. Okay, so it's something that's being worked on and developed as we speak. I'm sure in
Yep.
conjunction with the MAPS program and from an assessment standpoint, how do you guys deal with dormant psychotic gene makeups that you can't really assess for, or if the patient has a history of it? Because by taking psilocybin, you can wake something up that might not have that has been dormant, and the patient themselves might not have been aware that they had it, and then you open up a whole world of long-term mental health issues. What are some of the steps that you guys are taking, whether it be from gene testing or deeper dive into family origin diagnoses? Like, are you guys thinking about that? What does that look like for your team?
Yeah, again, you're highlighting that there's going to be real consequences from this. I mean, yeah, you can observe family systems, you can ask, get all the facts you want at the end of the day, but if something is deeply rooted in there and dormant, there's an issue. I think one way to be thinking about it, instead of just providing an immediate macro dose, to an individual, you could start with microdosing procedures. You could say, look, we're going to see what this looks like at just 200 milligrams, which is supposed to be a I'm forgetting the language here, but it's sort of a before the visuals in the room starts changing and all that type of stuff. Like, there's no visuals taking place in that type of thing. Maybe these lower doses might highlight a profound sort of manic episode just on the other side of the door before you even get to that macro dose. And so I think there are ways to slowly integrate it into the patient setting without creating a macro dose statement on the beginning. We're just going to dive right into this. And I think there's going to be some responsibility that takes place in there. I'm hopeful, certainly, that, with the research that is available to us and out there as well, too, we can highlight different ways as well, too. There's a lot of phase three trials that are taking place right now that have past the phase 2 or phase 1, phase 2 safety, protocols. And so I think we've got more in front of us in that regard. But I think you're right. I think at some point, whether it's good behavior or bad behavior, individuals are going to slip through the cracks here, and it's going to have consequences like, psychiatric issues and that sort of thing. And again, too, I think as long as we're negotiating those consequences and being sincere about them, because all things have consequences associated with them. I don't want to be too slippery slope. Like, yeah, we're not going to get rid of skiing just because skiing, causes accidents and people like Gwyneth Paltrow get, injured in the process, right? But that through these regulatory agencies and these bodies, they take seriously like integrating approaches to this, and as best we can thoughtfully lay out something that's going to, remove more people away from the consequences, then it'll invite people towards those consequences. So I know that's not going to be a satisfactory, for the viewers out there, but this is one of those off ramps that requires great thought and consideration in a way that I want you guys to know here in Colorado, the Natural Medicine Health Act and all the people, they're thinking about it in a way that we were not thinking about it, I think, under the medical marijuana movement. And many of the creators of the medical marijuana movement are also creators of the psychedelic movement. And not one of them, I think, if they were on this episode with us today, the directors and so forth would say, like, yeah, we learned a lot from that and we know how to do it better now.
Mm. How important is integration in this process?
Can you expand on that? Like, what do you mean by integration?
Well, a lot of people would say that people who do psychedelic sessions, psychedelic treatment, that it's the integration, it's the sessions after the psychedelic session that is the most important to unpack what happened during the session, because it's challenging. Yep. It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, Dr. I don't think she'd mind me stating this. Dr. Dana Lehrman with Skylight Psychedelics here in Colorado. She's a big part of the MAPS protocols and some of the research out there. Also provides experiential strategies within the state and across state lines. I believe Skylight Psychedelics also goes out into New York City. Dr. Scott Bienenfeld is out there. Obviously it's not legal out there and whatsoever, but just talking about kind of the expansiveness of their space. But she has a beautiful metaphor that she talks about it kind of as just a sack of rocks, right? We have a sack of rocks of all of our problems in this world, right? And psychedelics for her is really just the ability to pull kind of one rock at a time, kind of put it out in front of us and see it for what it is in this regard. And the therapist's job is to highlight all of those rocks that are being taken out at the same time. What we're not going to do in this intervention, as far as I understand it, is fix the rocks as they're coming out, right? And I also think when we talk about bad experiences or challenging experiences or those types of things, I think the thing that goes wrong within those psychedelic experiences, from what I'm aware of, at some point too, we're gonna have to come out and say, yeah, I know what it's like to go through these experiences. I personally know what it's like to go through the experiences. But also, when you're sitting in front of something that's tense within a setting that might be leading to a bad experience, I think what causes that in the experience is we're trying to fix it under a medicine that is putting us on a journey. We're not in charge of that journey. The medicine is, right? We're just sort of supposed to be observers within that journey. And I think bad trips come about when we go to try and fix things or navigate them, because it doesn't really give you the conscious executive functioning to go, you know what? Let's dive into that trauma experience right now and just fix that while we're here. And so I think Dr. Lehrman's point here is, to your point, a beautiful way to look out of it. We're just going to set all these rocks out. The therapist's going to document everything that came out. And then the integration that follows, to your question, is where the work actually happens, as far as like getting well, coming up with, solutions and that type of thing moving forward. So I really do think the experience is more observational than like getting in there and fixing things while it's taking place.
Yeah, I love that you said that, and I think that that's super important to clear up here in the way that you're kind of putting it out there. The psilocybin treatment or MDMA or ketamine or whatever else that comes out moving forward, it's not the one all be all, right? It's not like you're going to take this and you'll be cured, right?
Right.
This is something that we can use as a tool, just like we use CBT, DBT, EMDR, somatic experiencing, havening, whatever modality you want to incorporate. We're going to incorporate as many of them as possible to create a wraparound kind of treatment for you. Because, taking these types of medicines can be great in the moment, but when somebody is not taking them 6 months or a year afterwards and they get triggered by something, it was great in the moment, but in that particular setting, it might not have helped them, right? And so it's not the cure; it's just a way for us to explore how to get to a solution, right? And so I think,
right.
I know I appreciate the way that you're describing it and your philosophy behind it, and I hope that continues throughout your journey and really developing your programs. I envy you guys because you're ahead of us and being given that opportunity to do so. And I'm really excited to see where you guys end up with this. So, Brandon, is there any last thoughts that you would like to leave with the audience? I know we talked a lot about, the treatments and the aspects, but what are you most excited for in the next couple of years as you guys all ramp up for 2025?
Yeah, um, one, I'm really hopeful that the fragmentation of our industry will go away and we can come forward. And the Colorado providers, Ben Court and his program, the Colorado Coalition that exists for our industry, we're trying to come together and create a more unified front for patient care that I think is important. And by that, I mean, we're slowly dissolving our philosophies about how to treat the individual and approach it more holistically in this regard. And holistic has been one of those, 2-cent words across many addiction treatment center
Hmm.
websites at the end of the day. But, from that spiderweb approach language I talked about earlier, I think it's essential. And not everybody gets psychedelics at the end of the day, but it should be a tool within the quiver belt, right? At the end of the
Hmm.
day, to support individuals who might be suffering. And it may give rise to one more life being saved in a way that we're currently incapable of doing as an industry. And so, what I've, continued to promote, even though I'm advocating for this, when I was doing the advocating in front of the Senate Finance Committee recently, I did it on 2 separate days. Two mothers came on right before me, and they were like, "Look, my son got online, got a god dose of these medicines. Took them. I panicked as a mother. I called emergency services. Loved one jumps off the roof, dies in my arms. Right."
Mm.
There are real consequences to this, and we need to be talking about those consequences so we can have better solutions in place versus, for example, putting people in jail, right? And I think that's part of the anti-prohibition side of this things. It's like, how do we balance these regulated and unregulated markets at the same time without collapsing back into the historical sort of prohibition movement? And so, ultimately, I just want to encourage your listeners and viewers out there to just have an open heart and open mind out there. The suffering in our world is incredible right now, in a variety of different ways. You can give a person all the psychedelics in the world, but if they walk back out and they have poor nutrition, can't find time and place for movement, can't make a daily wage, and they're impoverished, at the end of the day, that's going to be an ineffective solution. And so, broadly speaking, we need better strategies at not just the individual level but the communal level as well too. And as long as we have an open heart and a mind to these things, I think as a community we can better come together to negotiate this, so long as we're not living at the pulls of the silver bullet or this is just another drug problem for America. And I'll leave you guys with that.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that. I applaud you for that. Brandon, again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we're going to have you on again to discuss where you are in your journey with Peaks. And thank you for all the listeners. Please rate, review, comment, share wherever you hear or listen to or watch your podcasts or videos. And we look forward to seeing you guys on the next one.
Thank you, Brandon.
Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate your time, bud.
Thank you guys.
All right.
Absolutely. Have a great one,
You
Yeah,
guys.
as
you
well.
too.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.